Okay, a wonderful, diverse range of points made by our panel there. I'm going to open it up straight to the floor, so I'm hoping that at least a few people will have questions. I'm going to group those questions in parts of the room. So I think we'll start over this side, and we'll go first to that person in the middle.
Hi, Ian Thornton, UK CDS. Thanks, Duncan, for a thought-provoking presentation. I wanted to ask how traction with national governments works, given what we know both about fragile states and the fact that they seem not to be meeting the MDGs. Is there any point having traction with an ineffectual government? And also about Andy Sumner's work on the changing demographics of poverty. If the sheer numbers of poor people are in India and China, and they're not particularly receptive as national governments to outside advice, again, is that the right targeting? Thank you.
Thanks very much. There was one here at the front.
I was very interested in all three presentations. So Michael Powell, IKM Emergent. But I've got a particular question for Chris Whitty. I really understand the point that if you're sat in a room and there's someone presenting you some evidence and someone else isn't, that the rationale for going with the evidence is very powerful. I'm kind of interested in how you then take into account, or if you can take into account, power differences within that. If one is looking at, you know, an argument between the World Bank and, say, just to be controversial in the room, an economist from Eduardo Mondlane University trying to use local knowledge or locally gained evidence and statistics which may not be as rigorous in their collection and maintenance as the World Bank's data, but then, you know, massive difference in resources available for collection. You know, the concern is that becomes a kind of the power relationships get transferred uncritically into power differences in evidence production and then into decisions. That's my question.
Thanks for that. Two questions from this side of the room.
Thanks, everybody. That was fascinating. I'm going to just pick up on Duncan's talk, but could ask lots of questions. I'm Simon Burrell, Director of Involve. Duncan, I found what you had to say very persuasive. Basically, we should stop worrying essentially about the debate and try and think about data. You said lots more than that. But it leaves me in a bit of a spin, which is that just across the way somewhere, IDS is doing its Participate project, which is trying to engage the poorest, most marginalised in what they think the goals should be. But if we've already got this Christmas tree of what NGOs think with 80 things from one meeting, should we be listening to the poorest? And kind of what you seem to be saying was not, because we don't need more evidence, we don't need more goals. And it kind of leaves me in a spin about, well, what about democracy? What about hearing what people think? And how? And if we do think that's important, the second part of that question is, how do we get policymakers to properly listen to what they're saying? So we're doing a very small bit of research for IDS on how you might bring some of those voices into the policy process. And it's one of the big challenges. How do you stop their voices being cherry-picked? How do you make sure they're heard? And can they really have an influence on the MDG or post-MDG juggernaut?
Thanks very much for that question. We've got one more down here, and then I'll hand it back to the panel in reverse order of their presentations, so starting with Chris.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I wanted to talk as well as him about evidence. So first, what type of evidence we need, and what type of evidence we want, and how evidence is constructed. First, I want to talk about vulnerability and degradation, and how vulnerability is constructed. There's already research saying how construction of vulnerability and degradation is being used to justify interventions that actually help expand carbon markets, for instance, and just interventions that help international development agencies just continue doing their projects without actually bringing any positive impacts and positive change on the life of poor people. So for me, the evidence that is actually needed is to understand how these projects are changing the lives they say they are changing, and how we can actually challenge this manufactured success of these interventions. Secondly, I think we have a lot of evidence already now that could be used. We know oil, as Camilla said, no, about Mexico. We already know oil pollutes. We don't do anything about it. We already know about, as you also mentioned, the financial sector, all the corruption. Nothing is done. So let's do something with the evidence we already got, and let's look for evidence that really works for humanity. That's it. That's my point. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those 4 questions. So I'll hand it back to Chris. You can respond to any, but there was one at least directed to you.
To the last speaker, who I can see shaking her head all the way through my talk, so I can assure her that I actually agree with everything she's just said, and I will expand on that. Firstly, anybody who uses evidence just to prove that what they're doing is useful, to prove it, is abusing evidence in a shocking way. Essentially, they're lying with evidence. That is absolutely not what it should be doing. What we should be doing is testing, does this work or not, and not be embarrassed when some things don't work. Things don't work. That's just the reality. And we should be honest about that and move on and stop using the resources for the pointless things and start using for something that might be more productive. So I totally agree with that point. On the second, sure, we should do something about the points you've raised. The problem is, what should we do? And my plea was, there are very few of the solutions that people come up with have actually properly been tested and are politically viable. And I think it's testing out politically viable solutions is one of the things that is really most important in this whole area. And that can be across a whole range of different areas of policy. In terms of the power differentials, I agree. I mean, there's a real problem about power differentials, and that includes in the ability to produce evidence. But I'd make two points on that. One of which is we all, I mean, everybody in this room, I suspect, is very strongly committed to the idea of trying to strengthen the ability, we use the word capacity, but it's a shorthand we all dislike, but we all know what we're talking about, of developing countries, scientists and researchers of different sorts to produce their own evidence. We are certainly in DFID are completely committed to that. This is going to be a very long-term process. You know, this is not going to change around any time in the next 10 years. Well, it'll start to change, but to get to where we need to be, we are talking of decades away. But it is an absolutely essential thing for us to do. I think the other thing, though, is the World Bank may be very powerful and have a lot of resources. It doesn't mean it's always right on the evidence. In fact, I can quite definitively say there are some situations, and Bob used to work for them, so I'm going to look at him when I say this. I can definitely say that they are sometimes wrong, and it's perfectly possible to say to them, you're wrong, or at least what you've produced is flawed. It may or may not be wrong, but there's no way of telling. And so the fact that they're the World Bank doesn't, I think, mean that they actually have any kind of monopoly. And on demographics, I'll leave that one to Duncan, but the one thing I'll say on demographics is, well, two things actually. The first of which is, yes, it is true that the majority of poor people will be middle-income countries, but the probability is that will be a relatively temporary phenomenon. We just need to bear that in mind. But the other demographic shift that I think people are forgetting is the shape of the demographic profile of most developing countries. In many of the countries we work in, but sadly not all, the shape is radically changing. So that whereas in, up till now, you could really assume that the majority of poverty, serious poverty, was a child in a rural area, increasingly it will be an adult in an urban area. And I think that's something we need to think about quite seriously when we're trying to accrue our evidence for the future.
Thanks, Chris. I'll pick up straight from that. So we have passed peak child as a species, and the number of children being born is now falling. So there will be a massive demographic shift globally, and it's going to get very interesting. And Robert and I are going to lead a campaign on ageing, because that's clearly where the future of Grey Panthers is where it's at, I think. On the demographics, there's a another spirited wonk war between various people on where are the demographics heading. One group of people says, led by Andrew Rogerson at ODI, that we are moving towards a situation where in 20 years' time, a large percentage, maybe 80% of poor people will be in fragile states. And those fragile states will be low income and middle income, but they will be fragile. And what happens there, and this is relevant to the MDGs, in terms of the international community and in terms of domestic politics, is very different. So Aid still has a role in poor, fragile states, but the idea of state building is fundamentally different from what you do in middle-income countries. We find, for example, we're currently trying to sort of design a research program on this, that a lot of our successes are local. They're actually improving the links between civil society and local police chiefs in the DRC or local authorities, and actually trying to do national stuff is a complete waste of time. But you can do things either locally or in particular fragments of the state that are semi-functional and start to build those up. In fragile states, the window of opportunity question, which various people have talked about, that most of the time change is impossible, but there are moments. There are moments when interests are aligned. Some very interesting research from the LSE over 5 years on fragile states, saying it's these times when the interests are aligned, when you can actually make progress in fragile states. So you have to be much more agile, much more entrepreneurial. You have to be able to spot those windows of opportunity. So it's a very different dynamic to the middle-income countries, where at least for the moment, roughly, if you Andy Sumner seems to be pretty solid on the numbers, about 80% of poor people now live in middle-income countries. And there, dealing with poverty is primarily a domestic political issue. It's about tax, spend, regulation, effectiveness of government, investment in infrastructure, investment in essential services, and aid is fairly secondary. Now, what's interesting, and I hadn't really thought about it before Ian's question, was that you probably need different MDGs for those two groups of countries. The MDGs that will have a useful influence in a fragile state might well be more about shaping aid. The influence on a middle-income country would be league tables, for example. And again, not a conversation that's taking place anywhere that I know of, but an interesting question. On Simon, I'm torn on this. So there's an enormous kind of techno-euphoria, let's get everybody tweeting the future of the world thing going on. And part of me says, bah, humbug, I'm just an old fogey and I don't like that stuff. And I tried it. I went on the website and I had to select the 6 out of 16 things I thought were most important for my family, and I had to choose between health and education and climate change, and I just couldn't do it. It was just absolutely impossible. And what use is that exercise anyway? And there's a lot of that. But on the other hand, it's involving people at an unprecedented scale in a global conversation about the kind of world you want. But it seems to me remarkably thin. It's a very superficial exercise compared to national political debate, for example, where people are really deciding what sort of world they want. So I fear that it's kind of 80% PR and 20% substance or something like that. The only point I'd say on the final point, the final question on evidence, one of the interesting things that came out of Chris's battle with Ros on the blog was the back to good old Popperian understanding of the role of evidence is to prove things wrong. And that's really true in Oxfam. So when we get more rigorous on our evaluation, the first thing it tells you is that this thing you thought was your flagship project is having no impact at all. Oh my God. And then that's when it gets interesting, because that's when you go and re-examine everything. And that seems to be a really good role for the evidence work.
Great. Well, thanks. I agree. Let's do something with the evidence we've already got. But somebody famously said, interests always trump evidence. And I think that's one of those fundamental problems that mean that we have to remember that a push towards sustainability and addressing inequality are principally political problems. And currently, political institutions in most places don't properly represent all interests, especially, of course, those who are not yet born. So reform of our political institutions has to be pretty high up the agenda. On the national government front, I mean, I disagree with Duncan. I think a lot's going on. Certainly we and a whole number of actors are working at that national government level to get a sense of what they would like to see from this process and how what the limitations they see of the global process are in terms of properly listening to and representing how they can do stuff in terms of implementation and how you can get real differentiated contexts properly understood. But of course, at the same time, people also say the trouble with national governments is they're too big to deal with real problems, on the ground and too small to handle the big global issues. And actually, if you want to make real progress, you need to be engaging with local government. You need to be engaging with a whole set of other constituencies like Parliament, like media, like civil society, groups of various sorts. Finally, I wanted to ask Chris a question because you said that you've got a sort of huge range of areas in terms of the adequacy of the evidence that's available, not only in terms of need, but also in terms of what works. And I wondered if you could tell us where those bare patches are in particular.
You can do that before I hand it back.
It's a long list, but I would start off with two areas that everybody in this room would agree are essential: governance and education. But I could go on for a lot longer.
Okay, so we have at least 3 hands, 4. We'll start over here first. The one question on this side of the room.
Thanks. My name is Kati Welle. I'm a PhD student at the STEPS Centre. And my PhD is about monitoring access to water supply in Ethiopia, so very, very relevant to this debate. And I have an observation and a question related to that. In Ethiopia, the Joint Monitoring Programme, which is at the international level, monitors the MDG on water, says that access to water supply is 34% in 2010, whereas the Ministry of Water and Energy in Ethiopia for the same year says that access stands at 64%. So there's a huge range, and it's actually quite an abstract figure. And obviously it's also a political figure, which one do you choose, and so on and so forth. At the same time, an issue that I find really important is this figure is abstract, and how do you link it to decision making? Decisions on investments are made at the local level, and really important for that is how local water officers are able to monitor access to water supply. And here a huge issue is that there are irregular inventories of water sources, but so far, for example, in none of the countries that I know are people able to update whether water points are functional or non-functional, which is has a huge impact on access to water supply. So my question is, how can we support local monitoring processes and not look so much at the the top of the hierarchy, but at the data and information needs of people who monitor water on a daily basis? How can you break it down to the local level and make it meaningful?
Thanks.
Roland Jackson from ScienceWise, again a wonderful series of presentations. I hope it's not too personal a question, but directed at Chris Whitty. Very struck by your sense that you have personal views around Millennium Development Goals, but you wouldn't possibly sort of share those or let them influence you, and sort of gets to the heart of the extent to which personal values do or do not come into provision of expert advice from people in power in your sort of position. So are you really as saintly as that? How do you ensure that you are, and on the assumption that you are, how many other people in similar positions do you think are equally saintly?
Thanks. There were 2 more hands from this side of the room.
Marie Romsby from the Royal Society. I had a question for Camilla. You mentioned you'd like greater overlap between the high-level panel, the Open Working Group on the SDGs, the UNFCCC and the Green Economy Agenda. I just wondered how you think that would look and work, and whether also the other speakers agree that there should be more overlap, given that each process is politically quite difficult already.
Thanks. We'll be coming to Camilla first after the last question, which was from the back.
Thank you. It's Andy Sterling again, I'm afraid. Another great session, but I'm just struck by what I perceive as a slight contrast, which is good, with other sessions, and I invite the panel to respond. The contrast is this. We've heard in this session a lot really powerful stuff around political imperatives, moral imperatives, the crucial nature of evidence, the possibility of purely technical decisions, about getting things wrong, about getting things right. And when, as just occurred, a question is raised about gaps in this, the response comes back, more evidence. So I'm wondering, I'd be really interested in the panel, where is the space in this kind of discourse, which is crucial, for uncertainty and for ambiguity when we've got the evidence, we just disagree, or acknowledging that we actually may, some of the most important things we may simply not know. How does that play into the kind of discussion we've had for the last 45 minutes?
Thanks, Andy. Camilla, over to you.
Katie, yep. Monitoring access to water supply in Ethiopia. I mean, we certainly find that there's a huge gap between what governments claim and how community organisations see the same figures. One of the key areas we see that gap in is in levels of urban poverty that tend to be defined along some kind of rural poverty target. Whereas in fact living in cities is hugely expensive, particularly if you're poor, particularly if you're living on the outskirts of the city, particularly if you don't have access to many of the things that it's assumed that you have easy access to. So I think there's lots of fudge and smudge around figures in order to try and get further up the league table. How can you address that? Well, there's been quite a lot of work with transparency and participatory budget making at local government level in a number of the countries in West Africa that we've been working with, where local government makes explicit what its plan for the next 5 years is going to be in terms of delivery of different water supply systems, and people then have got a chance to kind of follow up, badger, contrast what's been pledged with what actually happens. So I think trying to establish that accountability and monitoring at the local level is really the only way in which you can hope to close that loop most effectively. Question of how you get less overlap between these different processes. It's really difficult to know, but I think one thing to do would be to make sure that you've got the champions of each of those processes coming together and finding ways in which you can identify a common set of outcomes. So the trouble is, of course, that very often the interest behind each of those processes is much more, well, we're rather special and different, and we're not going to kind of mess up our process by engaging with others. But on something like this, it seems to me that, we're not going to get a climate change agreement in 2015 unless we've worked out what the green economy and green economy tools might offer to that. We're not going to get sustainable development goals that can be agreed and implemented unless we've understood the national and local level elements of that and the ways in which actions and tools at that level can feed into the higher level purpose. This is really, I'm stalling on Andy Sterling's question because I think a lot of these questions are very ambiguous, and I think I will have to say I don't know the answer.
Okay, so I will head recklessly into the Andy Sterling question. I'm going to leave the data question to Chris because he does data and I don't. So Andy's question is a really good one, which is, in Oxfam we have long conversations about complex adaptive systems. These are not things we do in public, but and most people go completely glazed when we talk about those systems, and so I've started rephrasing it as, what do we do when we don't know what's going to happen? And that sort of helps people sort of get their heads around what we're talking about. And the characteristic of complex systems is, of course, that you can never know. You can never predict what's going to happen. However much evidence you gather in advance, however much research you do, you cannot know that Mohamed Bouazizi having his scales confiscated in a small town in Tunisia is going to lead to the fall of Mubarak. That is just not something that you can reveal through study. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything. So I think some examples of how we use thought and measurement in complex systems. One is mimic evolutionary processes. We're doing some very interesting work in Tanzania on accountability, deliberately setting lots of different hairs running in one region, working on accountability, and then seeing what happens, and then getting rid of the bad ones after a few months. And that's actually an interesting, when you can't predict what's going to happen, and what you need for that to work is good, effective feedback. So it's still measuring, but it's measuring in a different way. And that's one way that seems to be working. Another way which I'm quite interested in is something that Nancy Birdsall and the team at the Centre for Global Development is talking about, which is cash on delivery. That you say to a country, we will give you $10,000 for every maternal death avoided compared to your current rate, and we don't care how you do it. We're not going to try and prescribe policy. We're not going to tell you what works. We're just going to reward you if you get it right. And that's an interesting sort of shift to a kind of bonus culture, but a good one. So I think there's all of these things require, but what it mainly requires in this sense of uncertainty and ambiguity is people who feel comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, which is not characteristic of the aid business, because we've all been brought up as planners, and to suddenly shift from being planners to searchers and entrepreneurs is very difficult. And then systems which allow you to do that. When DFID gave us a chunk of money in Tanzania and said, just go and try things on accountability, it took us several months to be able to even enter it into Oxfam's database, because the computer said no, because we didn't have a clear objective, and so we couldn't even take the money for a while. This requires deep shifts in people's thinking and systems.
I mean, all very interesting questions. I'll start off. I'll take 3 or maybe 4 points. On uncertainty and ambiguity, I mean, I think it should have come out from what I said that my view is that in international development, we've got more uncertainty and ambiguity than we have anything else. And that doesn't mean we can't then do anything in those areas. If we just chose to work in the areas we don't have that, we would have a very, very limited palette of stuff, and it would be in a very restricted range, and everyone would rightly say that's wrong. So you have to work with ambiguity, but all you have to do is be honest about that and say, at the moment, with current knowledge, we don't know, so you're going to have to make your own best judgments. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and that's what politicians do, and that is their job, in a sense, and then they have to answer for it publicly. In terms of personal roles, I mean, of course, everybody has their own internal framework, which I would not want to claim that I don't start off with a whole series of biases, many of which I'm probably not even aware of, although using the word reflexive, which I don't particularly like, but all of us do try to work out what they are. But if you put it a slightly different way, if government was entirely run by, in a permanent civil service sense, a group of people who are activists for their own ideas, it would be utter chaos. The whole UK system, which we nicked from the Chinese, is designed around the idea that you try to be as neutral as you can be, accepting that of course you have biases, and the system is there to put a lot of checks and balances on that to try and minimize the extent to which you have civil servant activists, which should be a contradiction in terms. In reality, in their private lives, people can do and think what they want, but that you have to know what your job is in a particular role. And when I took this job, I accepted that was the case. And there are some areas I inevitably actually exclude myself from because I think I have conflicts of interest or have views so strong I don't think they are appropriate in that area. And I think I'm not particularly saintly. I'm certainly not as saintly as Bob, but I think any good civil servant probably would have given roughly the same answer. In terms of the range of figures and the statistics, very difficult area. And I think here I would like to differentiate between statistics on which people make decisions, of which the one you gave was a very good example, and statistics which in a sense people just bandy around as part of debate. In the UK, because statistics, basically if you use as the starting point for your political decision a statistic that is wrong, essentially you are putting yourself into a logical chain which is guaranteed to get the wrong answer, because you're starting off with false premises, and however good you are from then on in, you're going to get false conclusions. And so protecting the key statistics is actually one of the central things that government does. And the biggest rows I see in government, actually, are between ministers and their special advisors, mainly special advisors, who want to know the official statistics a day before they come out because they want to work out where they are. And the official the people in the government statistical service who actually say, no, you're not allowed it more than X before, and there's a rule book around this, and there's a national statistician who's completely independent of government. This is essential because that allows the politicians, in fact, although it's temporarily inconvenient, to believe the data they're working from, because the data have been, to the best of anyone's ability, got neutrally. And I think one of the things we try to do is help developing countries to increase their capacity to do this, because it does require an ability to collect, randomly sample and analyze data, which is quite technical, but is perfectly manageable, and it is an important area. But you've triggered off a completely different thought in my mind, which is one of the things that really concerns me is in many countries, and particularly larger countries, the decisions that are made that really matter in people's lives are local decisions made by local politicians or local civil society, and yet the technical advice is almost always given at a national or federal level. And that's fine if you're in a tiny country, but if you're in a country that's highly federated, let's say Nigeria or India, that is really seriously problematic. And I think getting things local is something we should all be trying to think about.
Thanks. One more round of questions before we break for lunch. Right, there are no hands up. Oh, there is one hand up. Okay, right at the back over there, in the corner.
Thanks. League tables. Duncan seemed to be very pro league tables. League tables could almost be as good as MDGs. I took it from Camilla that she thought league tables could be fixed, and that if you had everybody fighting for their place in the league tables, they'd find ways of screwing up the numbers. I'd be interested in how big a disagreement there is here. I'd also might be interested in Chris's view about how league tables play in British government. We've just seen some rather nasty things happening in the health service, which some people would say was due to an obsession with targets and league tables. So he might have a view about how league tables play out in a real political situation.
Any other questions? Okay, one here.
Well, again, I'd like to thank the speakers for 3 very thoughtful presentations. There was one point that cropped up in Chris's talk about simplification, which engages with an issue which came up yesterday, prompted by that talk about pre-distortion. And this is where it reflects on what is moral behaviour for the policy researcher. In order to engage, yes, we have to simplify. We know that the people we're talking to are busy, they have limited knowledge, limited absorptive capacity, they are constrained by political and economic constraints of one form or another. Therefore, if we do not tailor our message to a certain extent, we're unlikely to engage at all. In Roger Pelker's terms, that's just the basic scientist, the curiosity-oriented scientist. So we have to tailor to a certain extent, but the question is, to what extent should we tailor? I think all of us felt a bit uneasy about this notion of pre-distortion, because that could quickly escalate into a sort of arms race with each side pre-distorting more than the other. But if we've got to simplify, and I think also, Chris, I heard you mention thinking what is politically viable. So we have to think about, whether this is a right of centre government or a left of centre government, and tailor our message accordingly. And there seems to be a very grey area here as to what extent we can and can't tailor our message. I know of little or nothing written on this, and all that I do know is that each individual thinks they've got the balance right. They know of some people who've gone glib and as a result lost their integrity. They know of others who sit in their ivory tower and never engage. So I'd value the opinions of the 3 panelists as to where they feel this very grey boundary lies in terms of the extent to which we can or can't tailor our message in order to have the impact that we would like to see.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other last questions? We've got one from the front down here. I'll give you my mic.
Thanks, Miles Parker from Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy. I was very struck by something that Camilla said, talking about the principles of SDG, when she talked about a principle of universality and the need to actually achieve a balance between dealing with underconsumption on the one hand and overconsumption on the other. And while the equity of the proposal sounds admirable, I'm just interested to hear from her a bit more about how she thinks that would actually be achievable.
Thank you very much. I'm going to completely abuse my position as chair as well and ask a question, but being even more abusive, I'm actually going to ask it to somebody not on the panel. I'm going to ask who has recently been anointed Saint Bob, holder of the Global Risk Register, a bit more about Future Earth as an evidence gathering process, but also feeding into these global discussions and global level policies. I just wondered after hearing from the panel whether you could, link up with some of the things that the panel have said. Firstly, looking at global change as you will be doing, to what extent will you be linking global environmental change to activities in particular countries or regions, and assigning blame in a way, linking to Duncan's point about naming and shaming, and further taking Chris's point about solutions, to what extent will Future Earth be looking at policies which have worked in changing to actually transforming, as you said, towards pathways to sustainability. Very cheeky of me to do that, but I just thought that it was quite a key point that was raised by all of our speakers. I'm going to go to Chris first, and then if you can pass it along, we'll end with Bob.
Great. League tables. My view about league tables, for what it's worth, is that they are a tool like many other tools which can be useful in some ways, pointless in some ways, and very destructive in some ways. And I say this as a practicing doctor as well as a civil servant. And they do drive good practice, but they can also drive people to follow the wrong targets, or they can be taken to extremes. And I think, therefore, you use them as a powerful weapon as you would use money or any other kind of powerful weapon that can be double-edged, it would be my view. But I think the number of occasions where they've done harm probably exceeds the number of occasions where they've done good, would be my personal view, but I have no evidence based for that. I'm just responding to the question. In terms of simplification, I'd like to put it a slightly different way, because I think this is often misunderstood. Most people in this audience are teachers of complex ideas. And their art is to take a whole range of very complicated ideas and distill them down to its essence in a way that is easy to communicate, and then they do it. And they don't see that as a biased process, so they simply see that as part of their job as an academic. My view about simplification is exactly the same. What you're aiming to do is to make it comprehensible without changing its meaning. So you're bringing all these complex ideas and you're in a sense giving the essence of it fairly and accurately to the person. Now, in terms of the political issues, sometimes to make it easier for someone to follow, it is easier to frame it in language which particularly runs with the grain of their own thinking, so that it lands with them just as you would in an ordinary lecture, actually. The way you'd pitch something to one group is different from the way you're going to pitch something to another group. And we all think about that as we walk in to give the lecture at the beginning. And so, but that isn't actually distorting the message. All you're trying to do is make it an easier thing for someone to digest without immediately getting antibodies, because you've used 2 or 3 words that are just going to really annoy them and mean that they misunderstand the point you're trying to make. A very fair one. The question you asked was just directed to Bob. I'm just going to add one final point of my own, which is, if you passionately believe you have a solution to a problem but you've not properly tested it, I'm prepared to bet you that there is a greater than 50% chance that you're wrong. And I think we should all start off with that as our starting point, and I think that will make a lot of us a lot more honest about where we go in terms of development.
Thanks, Chris. I'm told that LSE introduced a league table system where they published how many media hits and social media hits their various faculty had got in the previous month, and it actually changed behaviours in quite an interesting way and got people actually taking communications more seriously. I think league tables in weak traction systems like the international system or a typical university, probably is quite a good way of shifting behaviours. League tables in a very high traction system like I am your boss and we're going to publish a league table is probably more likely to lead to the kind of perverse outcomes you were talking about. Again, just speculation. I think if the Human Development Index, if instead of the whole MDG experience, they had taken the Human Development Index or a similar kind of exercise and published regional league tables every year, I think that would be a very interesting sort of thought experiment to see whether that would have had more impact on national politics and national spending priorities than the MDGs. NGOs love simplifying. We don't think simple is the same as simplistic. And I think a lot of people in academia sort of are instinctively averse to too much simplicity because they're worried that they're going to be caught out somehow. We don't worry about that kind of stuff. We do killer facts. And I'll give you my best ever killer fact, which is going to probably be on my gravestone, was just working out that the average European cow gets $2.20 in support from the European Common Agricultural Policy per day, which is more than the income of half the world's people. Now, that comes with a whole bunch of footnotes. It's completely transparent. It's support, not subsidy. But the media immediately changed support into subsidy. That's not our fault. You know, and it just went crazy, went viral. And just how it works is it's a framing device. It says the Common Agricultural Policy has got its priorities all wrong, and Europe has got its priorities all wrong. It's not claiming to be a solution to how you do cap reform. And I think that is I would actually say that is a more honest way of communicating than pre-distortion, which worries me too. I don't think this is a negotiation. I think you make it as simple and punchy and transparent as possible, and then you let the debate go. So that's my thing on killer facts.
Yeah, Fred, thanks for your question on league tables, good or bad. Yes, certainly they can be fixed. I think league tables also have a fairly limited shelf life in the sense that I think they're a good way of flagging something up for 2 or 3 years, after which they rather lose their edge. Some people or some countries are always at the bottom and are always going to be at the bottom, in the same way that, you know, some schools tend to stay at the bottom in the UK school league tables, and so therefore you should be thinking much more about the improvements that have been made from a particular position rather than the absolute level. I do worry about the skew that it introduces, with people just focusing on that as a indicator rather than perhaps a broader set of measures. We have a big argument about simplification all the time in IIED, because we recently introduced a wonderful woman who acts as our staff writer. And for quite a long time, a lot of our researchers thought making something simple and clear was the same as dumbing it down. And it's only over time that most of them have appreciated that actually you can do, as Chris said, distill the essence without dumbing it down, and making it accessible at one level, and then saying where they can find out more information, you know, if they want to get deeper into it. How ready, though, is government to accept uncomfortable messages? I suppose it depends on how you present them and who you talk to. I certainly find that there are people in the civil service who very much want organisations like ours, like IDS, to play that challenge function and to question some of the choices that are being made. Miles, your question about how easy it's going to be to address overconsumption. I think we'd probably all agree that some kind of universality principle was important, particularly if you accept the idea of planetary boundaries. I mean, I think if you say, you know, we don't have to worry about the planet, then questions of overconsumption and inequality don't matter. But I think within the context of accepting that there are planetary boundaries where we're not sure exactly where, but that there certainly is a sort of more for us, less for somebody else equation underlying it. I think the only way in which you can deal with what is a politically very difficult message is to say, well, actually, the real costs of your consumption are not currently properly reflected in the prices that we are paying. Social and environmental costs are not being factored in properly, and we need to rejig that. I think the other thing is that fairness is key to asking people to make changes. And if a government wants to get people to make changes, it needs to be able to show that everybody is having to make changes in proportion to their means. Without that, I think it's politically toxic.
Thanks very much. I think in a way that links to what I was asking Bob about, and hopefully this can join up some of the discussions earlier this morning about global evidence at a global level, and how that feeds into processes like the SDGs.
Yes, I mean, with Future Earth, it's meant to be an internationally coordinated program. In other words, it's meant to coordinate research around the world that could not be accomplished without international coordination. But however, all research is going to have to be very, very local. If you're thinking about biodiversity, agriculture, water resources, by definition, they're not global in that thing. It's got to be very place-based. So Future Earth is going to have to think through how do you have internationally coordinated programs working on local issues, and that will actually be the challenge. So we have to be very place-based. Equally, IPBS has not got to just do a global assessment, but it will do regional, sub-regional, and stimulate national assessments, which will have to look down at the national level, which means that both in a program like Future Earth, given it's got transformation at its centre, an IPBS that is looking to how to improve the science policy interface, we are going to have to look at the successes and failures of policies, or the successful and failures of technologies or behaviour change. However, we have to be very careful not to generalise. What might work or fail in one place may work or fail for different reasons in another place. A great example was in the agriculture assessment. We were having a meeting in Malaysia looking at the Green Revolution, and effectively, was the Green Revolution a success or a failure? And that's a badly posed question. First, the Green Revolution wasn't a single thing. It was new hybrid crops, it was intensification, it was rural, it was actually inputs. A person from Vietnam got up and said it's the greatest invention ever, and Borlaug deserved the Nobel Prize. An Indian community worker got up and says, I view it as the worst thing that ever happened. It was the Holocaust. It was equal to the Nazis in the Second World War. Now, these were two very different worldviews. Why? In Vietnam, rice production had gone up by a factor of 5. They had double cropping, and the yield per crop was about 3 times. The Indian worker said the problem is the Indian government put all of its effort into the irrigated areas in northern India and were totally forgotten about the local areas which were rain-fed. And the poverty and the hunger in her part of India got worse, not better, after the Green Revolution. And so what one had to ask was, okay, what were the elements of the Green Revolution, and why in some areas did they work for a benefit of society, and why in other areas did they fail? So you can't simply say the Green Revolution was good or bad. You have to dissect it. And so therefore one had to look at not only the policies behind the Green Revolution, the technologies behind the Green, how the market worked, but how they were implemented as well. And so I think both Future Earth and the IPBS is going to have to dissect the policy framework and actually works under what conditions can some processes be successful or fail. And by definition, that has to feed into the MDGs, has to feed into the SDGs. So the challenge for these large international programs is to what degree can we become local, but if we can't, we clearly can fail. Because these generalizations about what works and what fails are generalizations. So it is a question of how can we do case studies that effectively help to understand what things are replicable and what things are not replicable. But clearly, the science behind Future Earth, the international assessment, not just IPBS, but clearly assessments like IPCC and other ongoing assessments like the oceans, have got to feed into the SDG process of the MDG. We need to listen to their needs, and we need an exchange. We need a partnership, basically, and which is the whole issue of co-design, co-production, co-delivery. And so we need a radical change of how the scientific community works with the public and vice versa, and of course with the very vested interests, which are, I mean, Camilla knows better than me. I mean, a major part of the Blue Planet paper was the issue of vested interests, and why all the way from the very local level to the global level, who is controlling the debate. In the US, big private companies, they're not all equal, really control much of the debate. I think the public has much more role in Europe than it does in the US. But you have to understand these vested interests in both developing countries and how you work with it.
Great, thanks, Bob. Just also thanks very much to the panel. If you just join me in thanking them in the usual way, then I'll leave you to go to lunch.